While synthesis is about recognizing patterns within and across texts, our next topic, intertextuality, is about recognizing conversations across texts and seeing literary works as participating in an exchange of ideas. The concept of intertextuality means that literary texts speak to each other. They offer ideas, they respond to ideas, they revise ideas, they engage with the cultural and historical issues of their time, or they resist historical engagement. It means that the texts we read speak not only to us, but also to each other. Stories, poems, and plays have conversations with other stories, poems, and plays, and with their own context and history. A cool thing about literary texts is that they exist as a cultural artifact, a concrete item that is of its own time. But at the same time, because they're made of words and ideas, they also exist outside time in a way. And so that's why we can talk about intertextual conversations. Sometimes an author might intentionally respond to another text, but often that's not the case. What we often see instead is that literary texts grapple with concepts, themes, ideas, and issues that are real and relevant to lived experience. And this commonality links texts to each other so that lines of communication are created across them, sometimes with the author's intention and awareness, and sometimes without it. Because of this, a reader's involvement is necessary to intertextuality because we can only recognize conversations across texts that we've read. You could, for example, see an intertextual conversation between the Ballad of Birmingham and a thread of Black Lives Matter tweets from 2020. Even if the writer of the tweets wasn't thinking about the Ballad of Birmingham, even if they've never read the Ballad of Birmingham, you could still make the argument that there is an intertextual dialogue across these two texts. Both texts are historically bound, taking place in a particular moment in history. Both historical moments involve civil unrest, and maybe the two texts share a central conflict or question, like the role of violence in civil rights protesting. If you were to explore the intertextual conversation between the two, you would need to identify what questions are being asked and how they're being answered. How do the tweets respond to the concerns of Ballad of Birmingham? How does the Ballad of Birmingham respond to the perspective of the tweets, etc.? This concept of intertextuality has clear connections to the topic of discourse and discourse communities. Remember that we defined discourse as a cultural conversation about a topic within a community that shares a common language and a common understanding about cultural ideas, concepts, or issues. Often, intertextual conversations occur around dominant, competing, and subversive discourses. And we can position the ideas and the conversations within the context of discourse communities. Let's look at an example of two texts that are in dialogue with each other. Rita Dove's Daystar and Ellen Bryant Voigt's My Mother. Daystar was published in 1986, and My Mother was published in 2011. Both authors are American. Both of these texts center on the portrayal of a self-sacrificial mother. If we think about the discourse community for these two poems, we could identify something like the Midwestern American family. A dominant discourse that both of these poems represent is the idea that mothers do and should make sacrifices for their families. The prevailing view is that generally mothers are the hardest working members of a family. In order to think about the intertextual conversation between these two texts, you'd have to determine what their shared concerns or questions are, and then explore how they answer those questions. Some questions these two poems address might be, what is the value of domestic labor? What is a mother's motivation for the work that she does? What does a mother desire? You can probably think of additional questions the two poems address as well. As with all of the topics we've been discussing in this unit, there isn't one right answer. It depends on the perspective that you bring to the texts and the perspective through which you analyze them. After you've identified shared questions or concerns across the texts, you can start to think about how each addresses those concerns, and then how they would respond to each other's response. Both of these poems seem to agree on the idea that domestic labor for a mother is unending and repetitive. But they disagree on the mother's perspective. My mother, we might say, suggests that the mother's ceaseless work is motivated by a desire for her children to be who she wants them to be. And she measures her own worth by her success. When her efforts seem to be failing, when they're not producing the results she hopes for, she doubles down. She sleeps less, she works more, and there's a sense of disintegration of the formalities that she used to value. Early in the poem, she has lipstick on her lips. Later, she has lipstick on her teeth. And by the end, there's no lipstick at all. Daystar might respond to this portrayal of a mother by arguing that there is no motivation, that the disintegration comes not from the mother's inability to achieve the results she wants, but because domestic labor is mundane and repetitive. In Daystar, there is no goal, there's no long-term view. What the mother desires is nothingness, a ceasing of all work and all relationships. While My Mother creates a complicated space for the idea that domestic labor could be fulfilling, Daystar does not. So we might say that Daystar responds to My Mother using a subversive discourse about motherhood and labor. This is just a brief example of how you could begin to think about and explore an exchange of ideas or a conversation between texts. Your two main assignments for this module will give you the opportunity to practice this. For the first, you'll do an exercise in which you'll identify central questions and concerns in the assigned texts, and then map out the ways in which each text approaches and responds to those questions and to the other texts. Then you'll do the same thing again with new assigned texts, but this time you'll write a more formal exploration of the intertextual conversation. And just as we've been practicing in all of your assignments for this unit, you'll end by making an interpretive statement that expresses your sense of the overall conversation among the texts. Then you'll write a reflection in which you identify a discourse community of the assigned texts and identify both a dominant and a subversive discourse that the texts reflect.